C60 olive oil is a popular choice for people wanting to activate their full potential. Improved sleep, faster recovery and more energy are just a few of the amazing comments received from our customers who take a spoonful a day. Make C60 oil a part of your daily routine and see what it can do for you. Activate your potential today at thec60company.com.
Hello and welcome to this David Icke Dot Connector videocast. Well, for those around the world, we've got an election on in Britain at the moment. And the two party leaders that have a chance of becoming Prime Minister are the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and the opposition Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I don't support either of them. And I certainly don't support Jeremy Corbyn, not least because of an extraordinary lack of backbone over the Brexit debate, and also how he has allowed his party to be taken over by apologists for Israel. And I mean taken over. And he's reaping the consequences now, in that a campaign to paint him and the Labour Party as anti-Semitic, which has been relentless year after year now, has become the central point in interview after interview that he's been subjected to. It's brought up over and over again. And in the last few days, we've seen Corbyn interviewed and targeted on this very subject by a guy called Andrew Neil, who's a BBC current affairs interviewer. He viewed me a couple of times, once on the radio a long time ago, and more recently on television. I found him to be quite an unpleasant piece of work, frankly, and extraordinarily arrogant. But he does come out with some decisive questions on these political issues, but always from the perspective of the bubble that the political and media class permanently inhabit. And he went for Corbyn on this: the Labour Party is anti-Semitic. Are you going to apologise to the Jewish community? And then Corbyn was interviewed by comparison, a lightweight morning show host called Philip Schofield, who has the switch-on smile and also makes a good living, it seems, trying to persuade the public in TV advertisements to sell their car for less than it's worth on the basis of it's more convenient. And he too, of course, because he could virtue signal for the planet, went for Corbyn on the whole anti-Semitism issue. And Corbyn, who's made the situation more extreme because his response has not been the response that I'm going to say it should be in this videocast. Instead, it's been to continually apologise for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which are overwhelmingly, when decoded and translated through the Orwellian translation unit, becomes criticism of Israel. And so instead of coming out and saying what should be said, Corbyn's response is, well, we're dealing with it, and I think anti-Semitism is disgusting. Yeah, so do I. But what's also disgusting is to exploit it for political ends and for reasons of censorship and control, which is what I'm going to come to. So these two interviews were focused, certainly in the way they were reported, on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. What I do, not coming from a point of any ideology, is to listen to what people say, sentence by sentence. I don't care what political label they have, sentence by sentence, and judge the validity of what they say, sentence by sentence. Instead of saying, he's saying it, so everything he says must be wrong. There's something you learn if you care about maturely looking at the world. And that is, no one has ever lived, or will ever live, who doesn't have something to say that's valid. Some have more things to say that are valid, some have less, but no one has nothing ever to say that is valid. So you don't just wave people away in their entirety. You say, okay, I'm going to listen to sentence. Yep, I agree with that. Oh, no, don't agree with that. And so I look at Corbyn, and there's much of what he says I absolutely don't agree with, and more than anything, the lack of backbone is sickening to me anyway. But it's about fairness, and it's about justice, and it's about looking at things dispassionately and coming to a conclusion that way. And when you look at this hysteria manufactured of abuse that he has received and the Labour Party has received in a coordinated, calculated campaign to paint them as anti-Semitic, you can see very quickly that what is being done to Corbyn and the Labour Party is deeply unfair and certainly not valid. Will there be some people in the Labour Party who come under the heading of anti-Semitic? There might be one or two, yeah, of course. But you'll find them in the other parties too. Most of them. But the scale of, quote, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is being vastly overstated for political ends, to take control of the Labour Party, as has happened. So, instead of apologising and saying, yeah, but we're trying to deal with it, maybe, Mr. Corbyn, another approach, i.e. telling the truth, might have been a better strategy. So for the rest of this videocast, I'm going to lay out what I feel Mr. Corbyn's response to this hysteria, of course, absolutely promoted, again hysterically, by the media. So, I'm asked, if I was Jeremy Corbyn, am I going to apologise to the Jewish community for the Labour Party being so anti-Semitic. And it has to be anti-Semitic because I've read it, says the interviewer, in the media over and over again. The leaders of the Zionist political system, I've also repeated it again and again, so therefore it must be true. So, Mr. Icke Corbyn, what's your response? Well, first of all, Philip, Andrew, anti-Semitism, the term itself, is a misnomer, because Semitism, Semitic, is related to a series of languages in the Middle East and North Africa. And the vast, overwhelming majority of those languages are Arabic. So therefore, don't accuse me of anti-Semitism, because it doesn't mean anti-Jewish. If anything, it means anti-Arab, ironically. So now let's look at what is actually happening here and why the Labour Party is being subjected to such abuse and misrepresentation. By the time Corbyn came to power, the Conservative Party in Britain of Johnson and the Liberal Democrats, etc., would not say boo to Israel. They wouldn't criticise Israel except in the most mild way, and then almost never even on that level. The MPs in Parliament for the Labour Party, what are known as Blairites, their god is still Tony Blair, he of the mass murder in Iraq and all the catastrophes that have followed as a result, they would neither say boo to Israel or criticise them. I'm not talking about criticising Jewish people here. I'm talking about criticising a fricking government and its military. But when Corbyn came to power, he and supporters around him were still willing to criticise Israel for its grotesque treatment of Palestinians decade after decade. So something had to be done, because there is what I call the anti-Semitism industry and the protection racket. It's not a protection racket operated out of Israel that is protecting Jewish people from discrimination. It's a protection racket to protect the far-right government in Israel from legitimate criticism and exposure. And still, at that time, there was Corbyn, when he came to the leadership of the Labour Party, and many people within the Labour Party around him who were still willing to call out the far-right government and military in Israel. Like I say, something had to be done. And so the hysteria began, coldly calculated and orchestrated from the networks and representatives of the far-right government in Israel to sow condemn and label the Labour Party and Corbyn as anti-Semitic, that they would stop criticising Israel because they wouldn't want more claims that they're anti-Semitic. And that is exactly what has happened. And in the last few years, a new definition of anti-Semitic has been created and is circulating and is being accepted by more and more governments and institutions. And it's a scam. I'll give you a definition of, let's use the word anti-Semitism or the term anti-Semitism with the proviso of what I've said earlier about what it really means, because people will find that easier to follow because that's become the norm label. Here's a definition of anti-Semitism. Hating and being discriminatory against Jewish people because they are Jewish. End of story. That's a fair definition. And also, I would be in the front of the queue condemning anti-Semitism on the basis of that definition. Because one of the things I've been writing and talking about for 30 years is the ridiculous nature of self-identity with labels instead of self-identifying with the fact we're all expressions of the same consciousness in the end. The labels divide us, and they're meant to. But this new definition of anti-Semitism is nothing like what I've just said. It's so expanded the definition on purpose that it's encompassed criticism of Israel. Because it's a scam. And people are so terrified of being called anti-Semitic, they go along with it. And what did the Labour Party do? In the face of this abuse, it adopted the new definition. And people in the Labour Party, including Jewish people, are being expelled on the basis of this definition. So what is the outcome? Criticism of Israel by major political parties in Britain has ended, which is what this is all about. I'll tell you how ludicrous this has become. There was a Labour Party member called Cyril Chilson, an academic at Oxford University. And he was born in Israel. His parents survived the Nazis and the horrors of the concentration camps. And he joined, by conscription, first of all, the Israel Defense Forces. He then stayed on and became, it seems, a member of the Israeli army who would take foreign journalists around and show them what the far-right government in Israel wanted them to see. Cyril Chilson then moved to Britain. And he had learned by now, he says, what was really happening in Israel in relation to the Palestinians. Horrific. And so he was looking for a vehicle to express his feelings, looking for justice, fairness. And he joined the Labour Party. Cyril Chilson, son of Nazi surviving parents, concentration camp denying or concentration camp surviving parents, has been expelled from the Labour Party for being anti-Semitic. You know that this protection racket is just that, a protection racket for Israel. Not even Israel, the far-right government in Israel. When Jewish people who criticize Israel are subject to more abuse and vilification from these networks than even non-Jewish people. Because they're dangerous to the protection racket, because it's very difficult, though ludicrously they do try, to paint them as anti-Semitic. It's the same principle as those people who've made the transition to transgender, who's gone through the surgery, and then come out and say, I made a mistake. I was pressured into it. People, think longer before you go make the same mistake. If the transgender activist movement cared about transgender people, and that's what it was there for, it would be holding these people up and saying, hey, listen to these people. Don't make the same mistake that they say they've made. Instead, just like Jewish people who criticize Israel, transgender people who say, hold on, I made a mistake, are vilified and abused by the transgender activist extremists. Why? What's the common theme? The common theme is it's not about protecting Jewish people, and it's not about protecting transgender people. It's about pursuing an agenda. And if people you claim to support speak out against that agenda, well, they're going to have some. So Jewish people are being expelled from the Labour Party for being anti-Semitic. And there's a massive difference between Jewish people in general and Zionism, which is political philosophy. And it's Zionism that's driving this, not the Jewish community in general, not at all. So, one of the organizations that is really been at the forefront of this campaign of demonization of Corbyn and the Labour Party is called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, the CAA. Man and a dog organization, but of course gets access to the media, has worked so hard to stop me speaking in public because they believe in freedom. Well, their own freedom. And when the chairman of the CAA goes on the media condemning Corbyn, anti-Semite, and the Labour Party, they get, or he gets, softball questions, nodding interviewers. Yes, Mr. Falter, yes. none of them ever ask him why, if he's against, quote, racism, he is a member of the British board of an organisation called the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. The Jewish National Fund is an apartheid organisation, quite blatantly, that started at the turn of the 20th century and buys up land from donations around the world and takes land via the Israeli government. And once they've got control of it, only Jewish people are allowed to live on it. Now, if I've ever heard a definition of racism, Mr. Falter, British board member of the Jewish National Fund, who's against racism in the Labour Party apparently, then that definition of racism and apartheid is as good as it gets. I've put a video with this videocast about Jewish people and groups who are opposing the Jewish National Fund because it's an apartheid operation. Now, Mr. Neil, Mr. Schofield, are you going to have Gideon Falter on your programme and ask him how he can condemn, quote, racism in the Labour Party while being involved in an apartheid organisation, the Jewish National Fund? Are you going to do that? I'll take that as a no then. And then there's a story out this week involving the Jewish Chronicle. It's edited by a bloke called Stephen Pollard. Loves me. Just as much as the CAA do. Both of which I take as a compliment. Here's the headline. Jewish Chronicle lied in reports on Labour anti-Semitism. Oh, sits back in amazement, can't believe it. You don't say. The UK's main press regulator has reprimanded the Jewish Chronicle for significantly misleading claims in reports about supposed anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The Independent Press Standards Organisation called the newspaper's obstruction of the investigation into a series of articles published this year unacceptable. The press body upheld a complaint by a Labour activist named in the articles. It's a scam. For all the reasons that I'm explaining. And Mr. Corbyn, why haven't you stood your ground and said what I'm saying now? And you know what? Loads and loads and loads of people, great numbers of people in this country would have cheered because they're sick of it as well. Instead, it's, oh, no, don't. We're dealing with it by throwing Jewish people out of the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. So Israel now owns the Labour Party. People are terrified of speaking out because, on your way, mildest criticism. We've had an MP, a Labour MP called Chris Williamson, who's no longer in the Labour Party. He was suspended. Why? For the crime, because that's what it's become, of saying that the Labour Party has got down on its knees far too easily to this campaign of abuse and vilification. Ooh, saying that's anti-Semitic. What the hell isn't these days? As this racket expands. its definitions. There was a Labour Party activist who was interviewed by my sons recently, who actually said that people are being targeted in the Labour Party just for sharing information from my website. And you know, this video now that I'm in the middle of, there will be so many people in the Labour Party, decent people, caring people, who do want a better world, a fairer world, a more just world. They will be cheering as they watch this. But you know what? Most of them won't share it out of fear of the consequences. We are looking in the face of a tyranny. And I, for one, I'm not going to frickin' blink. Unlike Mr. Corbyn, whose eyes are going like a machine gun. Is it really racist or anti-Semitic to ask legitimate questions like how 0.2% of the global population can have so much power over censorship of what people can and cannot say? And I talk about 0.2%. The ultra Zionist extremists that I'm really talking about are a tiny fraction of even the 0.2%. And the vast majority of Jewish people have no idea what's actually being done in their name and why. And it's about time they bloody did. Because they get labelled on the same basis of the people who are actually doing it. Do you think that people may, how can I put it, have reservations about some of Israel's actions? For decades, going back to 1948, when the State of Israel was formed and before. Do you think that some of that perception might possibly have come from the actions of these ultra-Zionists? Do you think they will take responsibility that the fact that they may have had some input into why people see Israel, as many do? Of course not. It's always someone else's fault. If anyone criticizes Israel, it's not because of what Israel has done. It's because they're anti-Semitic, bigots, Nazis. Well, let's have a look. Israel was bombed and terrorized into being in 1948 through ultra-Zionist terrorist groups like Irgun and Lehi, or the Stern Gang. And so much terrorism was imposed on Palestinian communities at that period, and of course gone on since, that some 700 to 750,000 Palestinians fled their own land in 1948 and after, in terror that what had already been done to some would be done to them. And still, the Palestinians have their day of catastrophe each year, marking that disgusting, horrific situation. Now, I could give you so many examples of that terrorism, but I'll give you one. It's about a village called Deir Yassin. And I describe what happens in one of my books. And by the way, under this video is another video about the background to Deir Yassin. And this is what I say in one of my books. Mass slaughter of Palestinian Arabs by Zionist terrorist groups included the massacre in the village of Deir Yassin on April the 9th, 1948, shortly before the British officially left the country. Irgun and another revisionist Zionist terror group, that's extreme Zionism, also known as gun Zionism, known as Lehi, or the Stern Gang, had worked together with the Jewish militia Haganah to bomb, assassinate, and generally terrorize the British out of Palestine. They joined forces again for the mass murder at Deir Yassin. They slaughtered at least 107 Palestinians, the terrorists claimed 254, others said 240, including women and children, by throwing hand grenades into homes and shooting the defenseless. Jacques Duranier of the International Red Cross described bodies lying in the streets, with some disemboweled or decapitated. Benny Morris, an Israeli historian, recorded mutilation and rape. Investigator Zivi Ancori said, "I saw cut-off genitalia and women's crushed stomachs." This is the mentality that terrorized Israel into being. Why are you apologizing and bowing to the same networks now, Mr. Corbyn? The head of Irgun at the time of the massacre was the brutal revisionist gun Zionist terrorist Menachem Begin, 1913 to 1992, who became Prime Minister of Israel and had the nerve to condemn terrorism. The hypocrisy knows no limit. He also ludicrously and outrageously won the Nobel Peace Prize, like so many other war criminals. Begin was head of Irgun during its campaign of terrorism against the British and during the slaughter of the Arab innocent. Famous scientist Albert Einstein, along with other American Jews, wrote a letter to the New York Times in 1948 in protest at a visit to America by Menachem Begin, in which Einstein and his fellow Jewish signatories highlighted the slaughter at Deir Yassin. They said in this letter, "A shocking example was there, the Zionist terrorist, behavior in the Arab village of Deir Yassin. This village, off the main roads and surrounded by Jewish lands, had taken no part in the war and had even fought off Arab bands who wanted to use the village as their base. On April the 9th, terrorist bands attacked this peaceful village, which was not a military objective in the fighting, killed most of its inhabitants, 240 men, women and children, and kept a few of them alive to parade as captives through the streets of Jerusalem. Most of the Jewish community, the letter went on, was horrified at the deed. And the Jewish agency sent a telegram of apology to King Abdullah of Transjordan. But the terrorists, far from being ashamed of their act, were proud of this massacre, publicized it widely, and invited all the foreign correspondents present in the country to view the heaped corpses and the general havoc at Deir Yassin. Why? Because they wanted the other Palestinians to know what had happened so they would do what they did, flee the country. And note what the Einstein letter said. Most of the Jewish community was horrified at the deed. I repeat, there is a chasm of difference between the Jewish community in general and the extreme Zionists who act in their name. And let them take the reputational consequences of the acts of the few. And it really is time, Jewish community of the world, for you to call these people out and let's come together as humanity. As I've said in my latest book, The Trigger, no one needs to read that book more than the Jewish community to see how they have been scammed mercilessly by these extremists. So, Mr. Neil, Mr. Schofield, are you going to invite people onto your programs and ask them why they condemn the Labour Party as racist when they support the terrorism that has been imposed upon a particular race of people in the apartheid state of Israel? I'll take that as another no then. So, we have an open-air prison camp called Gaza, where the Israeli army control all the entrances and exits. And we have periodically thousands cumulatively of Palestinian civilians and kids killed and maimed for life with state-of-the-art weapons dropped from the sky over Gaza. We have kids, young people and other civilians shot dead, having their limbs shot off by Israeli army snipers on the other side of the fence, the Gaza fence, shooting through their long lenses, gun sights, killing journalists and paramedics who are very clearly marked. When is the anti-Semitism industry and the protection racket that's targeting the Labour Party going to apologise for that? I won't hold my breath or I'll quickly turn bloody blue. What about this chief rabbi of the UK came out this week condemning Corbyn, Oh, it's very significant, said the media. Oh, he's come out. It's not very significant at all. The most predictable act you can think of. Mr. Chief Rabbi of the UK, are you going to apologise for Deir Yassin? Are you going to apologise for 750,000 Palestinians fleeing their homeland and still in exile? Their successors? Because of terrorism of the most extreme kind? Are you going to apologise for the acts of the Jewish National Fund? Are you going to apologise for the fact that the successors, and those still alive, of the people that fled Palestine in terror, that they cannot be allowed back into their homeland, but anyone who's Jewish or married to someone who's Jewish and many other criteria, anywhere in the world can go there? Not a problem. Do you think, Mr. Chief Rabbi of the UK, that could just constitute apartheid? What do you think? What has happened in Israel, and what is happening now to protect those that are doing it, is that from 1948, the plan was always to control the entirety of the Palestinian land. For years, they talked about a two-state solution. It was never going to be a two-state solution because this was the plan. We talk about a two-state solution and self-government for Palestinians. But what we keep doing is kicking the can down the road, down the street, all the time. Kick it down the street, kick it down the street. And while we're kicking the can down the street, we will build more and more and more and more Jewish-only settlements on occupied, illegally, under international law, Palestinian land in the West Bank. And we are going to reach the point, eventually we're there, where there will be no land left for a Palestinian state, and we'll then move to calling it a one-state solution, which will mean that Palestinians who want to stay have to do so on the basis of a Jewish supremacy state, which is where we are. The law's been changed to make that happen. And now we have Donald Trump, who is owned by the far-right government in Israel, and more importantly, the secret societies that control the far-right government in Israel, not least the key one, known as Sabbatean Frankism. I've got a video under this video again, gives the background to that, explains it at length in The Trigger, which is why Jewish people need to read it. And we now have, in this ultra-Zionist-owned administration in America of Donald Trump, we have his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, Christian Zionist, coming out now and saying, well, basically, building Jewish-only settlements in Palestinian land it's not really illegal. And what's happened since Trump came to power is the building of Jewish-only settlements across the occupied West Bank has just increased and got faster and faster and faster and faster. Because the idea is they want the law. And always did. Whereas there are many Jewish people in Israel who would be quite happy to live in peace and harmony with the Palestinians, but they are not the ones that get in the headlines and on the news programs. Why aren't you saying any of this, Jeremy Corbyn? How old do you have to be before you reach the point where the truth is all you care for, and how people see you or abuse you is irrelevant to that truth? How long? How old do you have to be? The coordinated attacks on the Labour Party are part of a tyrannical operation to stop criticism of any kind of Israel and exposure of any kind of Israel and the far-right government of Israel, because where the government of Israel is going, orchestrated by this Sabbatean Frankism cult, is so extreme in relation to the Palestinians and so many other things that they have to build a defense mechanism that allows exposure to be censored. This is why all the censorship is going on in Silicon Valley. Do you know the campaign against anti-Semitism of Jewish National Fund board member Gideon Falter has actually been boasting in recent years that they are advising organizations like YouTube on what should be censored? Do you think that's a legitimate question to be asked and challenged? Mr. Neil, Mr. Schofield, what do you think? Yeah, okay. I'm sick of the bullshit. I'm sick of the hypocrisy. I'm sick of the bollocks. And I'm sick of what that means for a tragic people called Palestinians. Grow a pair, Mr. Corbyn. For goodness sake.